12, 2024 marks, of course, 25 years of Nigeria's unbroken democracy. As the country celebrates the day, President Tinubu delivered a sterling address commemorating the event. President's speech not only celebrated the nation's progress, but also underscored the ongoing commitment to entrench democratic values and, of course, economic reforms. Let's look at this speech and, of course, some other issues growing out from this development. I'm being joined by a senior economist at STIRS with experience in research and analysis covering commodities, consumer analysis, macroeconomy, and international development. Jumebi Oduwale, good afternoon and thank you so much. It's really good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
I think I'm going to start from the last report I read before introducing you. Our crude oil production seems to have dropped again. 1.25 million barrels per day is what is reported from OPEC, and we know that we are supposed to be doing better than this. What do you think is still happening, or what is responsible for this ugly development?
I mean, I don't think it's far-fetched news, knowing what exactly is hampering Nigeria's crude oil production and why we've continually, maintained suboptimal production levels way below our budget estimates or budget projections, and, OPEC's designated quota of around 1.58 million barrels per day. And this is primarily attributed to, lingering oil theft, vandalism, and lack and underinvestment in Nigeria's crude oil sector, right? So the fact that these issues have not been addressed, especially the first two, was still, battling with those problems, and they're significantly reducing Nigeria's ability to produce more crude oil. But more importantly, is also the fact that a lot of Nigeria's crude oil were already locked in crude swap agreements, right? So we have a lot of our new oil that is coming out of the ground that's already been paid for, right? So that's one of the reasons why we're saying that even when we do produce some oil, we're not really seeing this significant bump in government revenue, and how this should be translating into increased investments in the country and, generally increased productivity. So yes, that's pretty much it for Nigeria's crude oil production issues right now.
Speech. I took this away where President Tinubu said the reforms being instituted by this government is sure getting some bad some effects on Nigerians. That's negative impacts, talking about on their finances, purchasing power, inflation is on the high side. The president agreed to this. But he said there are necessary steps that should be taken. How does this come to you?
I mean, he's not wrong in terms of saying that there are necessary steps, but the steps being necessary also mean that some certain, I would say, cushion or how they should have been implemented or how they have been implemented is also another part which we need to consider, right? Over the years, we've spoken about the fact that Nigeria's fuel subsidy payments have continued to, increase, significantly, and this has reduced the government's capacity, right, to invest in other sectors of the economy because they keep subsidizing fuel. We saw this as unsustainable, and a lot of economists did clamor for the removal of fuel subsidy, right? Considering that if that money is taken out of fuel subsidy payments, they should be spent on other lucrative aspects of the economy. That's how it should happen, right? Then you also consider the fact that, okay, the exchange rate market at the time, was filled with a lot of capital control measures that continue to disincentivize investors from bringing in their money. We saw foreign portfolio investors leave the country. We saw foreign direct investments decline. And a major issue, even for multinationals that were in the country at the time, was the fact that the FX market wasn't as free as possible for them to operate in. All of this did affect, the economy negatively, and they did call for these reforms. In that sense, the reforms were necessary for us to implement because of the negative impact it had on the economy. Now, how they have been implemented is where the issue has been. so far since the beginning of the year, or I would say from last year when it started off, and the sustainability measures being put in place to ensure that the benefits that the economy should be deriving from these reforms should actually be in place. So right now, we're not seeing that, right? We're not seeing that happen. How the reforms have taken place have not benefited the economy, especially because of like the communication that started it off. It wasn't communicated properly, and there's just a lot of issues that have come into place with it.
Let's look at some of the specific interventions. Now, there is a 200 billion intervention fund that is meant for manufacturing sector, and I think also for small businesses and all of that. I would ask how you think this can be thoroughly distributed, if I can use that word. What more kind of interventions are you expecting?
So I would say it goes beyond the interventions for me. For me, it's a matter of, first of all, where we're intervening, like the sectors we're intervening in. And clearly the government is, somewhat on track in terms of they're trying to invest in small scale businesses, knowing fully well how important they are to employment in the country, and eventual productivity as output growth. They're also trying to invest in the agricultural sector. We're seeing those interventions, targeted towards agri. But more importantly is how these interventions are going to take place, right? You have 200 billion as an example, right? You want to give it to small scale businesses. How do you intend to do this? How do you intend to ensure that your monitoring and evaluation processes will make sure that this money actually achieves what it's supposed to achieve? What have you put in place? All of these communications are still lacking. So while it is good that we want to intervene in the economy, the most important thing right now is to tell the economy, tell people, tell businesses, tell consumers how you're going to ensure that this money that you're pumping into the economy, even though it might have an inflationary effect in the beginning, tell us how you're going to ensure that this money is doing what it's supposed to do, that it does translate into output, and you're going to put measures in place to make sure that the output is for lack of better, the output does make sense, right? For instance, if you're giving money to an MSME that is producing bread, right, to ensure that they're able to produce more and maybe even employ more people, what are you doing to ensure that their raw materials are not as expensive? Because if you give them more money to produce more bread, they might produce more bread, but the prices will still be high. So now we're having a double inflationary effect in the economy. Prices are still high, even though output to an extent might increase. And again, I want to even speak a little bit more on the on how the reforms have taken place. I was trying to make a point earlier to you about how these reforms have taken place, and specifically speaking to the communication aspect of things. Right. When a country takes up reforms, the expectation is that while these reforms take place, you do find a way to cushion the blow on the average consumer. Right. Unfortunately, even though we're seeing interventions here and there, we're seeing talks of social safety nets, conditional cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers. Even though we're seeing these talks happen, we haven't seen the government actually thin out its own expenditure. And that doesn't speak to people or even speak to investors and business owners to the extent at which the government is trying, or government will try to feel the pain of the average Nigerian, right? So even when you talk about interventions towards SMEs, the agri sector, which I think is good, we need to see a bit more on how the government is trying to trim down its own expenditure, from buying of SUVs to renovation of houses and things like that. They need to also tell people that they are in these reforms together with them. They're also feeling the pain. And I think until we do that, it will just still be a thing of today we hear this, the markets react in a particular way, and tomorrow is back to status quo.
Getting more interesting. Now, do maybe many of economists like you are saying that we are getting that handshake from the fiscal side and the monetary side, kind of working together to achieve inclusive growth. But my question to you now would be, what do we do on the trade side? What sort of conversation should we be having so that we can open up the trade and industry aspect of this country? What sort of policies should we be looking at so that we can support whatever comes from the fiscal and monetary side and achieve this growth? Where will this growth come from if we don't do this?
That's a very packed question. And I'll start with the fact that to an extent, right, we're seeing that, I would say, handshake. And I wouldn't really call it handshake. I would say what we need to see is consolidation, right? We need to see more consolidation. The hits, right, during economic crisis like this, especially economic crisis driven by spiraling prices, that's commodity prices, tagged inflation, and exchange rates. The hit often always sits with the monetary policy authorities, right? And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing the CBN talking, a lot of times they're getting a lot of jabs, and we're seeing them react very quickly to a lot of things. So if anything, I would say most economists are nodding in favor of what the monetary policy authorities are doing. We're still waiting to see how much more fiscal authorities can do to actually complement what monetary policy authorities are doing. In my opinion, standing as an economist, I would say I haven't seen enough, right? And I'm still going to be very blunt with that. I haven't seen enough. And I think most economists will agree with me that we still need to see a lot more in terms of good communication, good market signals, cutting of government expenditure on things that do not have any positive multiplier effect on the economy from the fiscal side. And until we see that, I would say the handshake can somewhat advance to even a hug or before becoming consolidation, right? But in terms of trade and in terms of trade supporting output growth,
yes,
I would say that all of this still boils down to productivity, and it still rests on the palms of the fiscal authorities. What are they doing to support the sectors to support our trade sectors? And that will, to support our trade sectors that will eventually become a thing of productivity for Nigeria. When we're speaking of trade, in simple terms, we're saying, what are we exporting? And before you answer the question of what are we exporting, the question is, what are we even producing? And if before you answer what we are producing, say, okay, if you're able to answer what we're producing, the second question is, are we even producing enough? So that just tells us where we are, right? Before we can produce, a lot of structural deficiencies have to be catered for. They have to be addressed. And the beginning of all of this is insecurity. Sadly, businesses are not willing to produce as much because where they will produce, where they have linkage effects, where they can connect or get access to raw materials from the farms, they're being pushed out of there. Right, farmers are not producing. So how will the extractive industries that need these raw materials be incentivized to set up shop there? So until we're able to address this issue of insecurity and how that eventually affects how much we produce and how we're producing, the question about productivity will always be there. And the question about trade and how that supports economic growth will also be there. The other aspect of it is the trade control measures, right? In terms of like tariffs, levies, and things like that. We're seeing, the federal government is saying that they're going to lift, temporarily lift like the import levy on some food items and bringing them into the country to reduce prices. That in itself might have an impact on, reducing imported inflation in the coming months. However, we also need to consider the fact that before this would have like a substantial effect on prices and how much goods even come into the country, you also need to consider the factor of the exchange rate, right? And what exactly is driving the exchange rate in Nigeria today? 4 key things: crude oil production and how much we're exporting and how much revenue we're getting from there. Foreign exchange inflows. We know what is happening there. Investors are still very cautious about the Nigerian economy, and that is, influencing how much capital that they bring in. They're still very worried about whether if they bring their money in, they'll be able to take it out. this is affecting capital inflows into the country and thus affecting, the foreign exchange market negatively. You look at remittance inflows. The government is trying to, issue a diaspora bond. And until we see how that responds, we already know that the diaspora community, in terms of bringing remittance inflows into Nigeria, how, like, through formal channels, we're also seeing that's some, to a very large extent, is also reducing. Then you also consider non-oil export revenue. There is the same issue about not producing enough to export enough to generate enough revenue in terms of foreign exchange is also, coming into play there. So again, it's still a very big question and a very big issue about productivity before we now even start considering, how trade will impact growth. And it all boils down and sits within the purview of the fiscal authorities.
I think it's a good way to leave it. But in 1 minute before I let you go, how worried are you about multinationals leaving the country? That's also something that is concerning at this time.
Yes, it's definitely worrying. If my worrying scale was between 1 to 10, I would say 7, 8, and that's on the high side. But then again, I see this as a symptom of, the backlog of issues that the Nigerian economy has been faced with over the past, say, almost 10 years. So right now, what the reforms just did was rip the Band-Aid off. These companies have been facing these issues before now. So unfortunately, it's just that now it's a bit much more than they can, absorb right now. And I would say it's a symptom of reforms, the symptom of the issues that we've been going through. This is not the first time. Nigeria will not be the first to experience this. So there will be light at the end of the tunnel. We might see these companies even come back or continue to have affiliations with Nigeria just under a different business model, just so that they can make more money, make profit, and employ more people. But then again, it just still boils down to us actually achieving the benefits from our reforms. If we don't do that, we will see more companies leave instead of coming in.
Jumebi Oluwale, she's a senior economist with Stairs Business. Thank you so much. It's good to have you on the program. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. I'm glad to be here.
All right, they're coming up next on the show. We'll still